When you're working for big institutions, I think you quite quickly realise that you have a lot of colleagues who work on that theory. The safest and easiest thing is to do nothing. Set against that, I can remember now a lot of years ago as a student looking at those Utin lunettes of the landscape and the garden and just being completely fixated by them, just the sheer beauty above anything else, and then slowly bringing in the plants, the agriculture, which we've talked a lot about. But I think my overriding impression was still the beauty and the sense of harmony. And I felt myself very sophisticated buying a poster with all of the lunettes on them, and that still sits in my office today. So something in all of that time has remained fascinating. And I've been very, very fortunate in life to work with a number of people who have tried to create their own little version, sometimes not that little, version of the same lunette, their own little world. And when Nancy and I were talking about what sort of talks we thought might be appropriate for this conference, one of the things that I think I particularly was interested in was the madness of trying to create that, something that I had never thought of as a student looking at those lunettes. The reality is that quite often people put in inordinate amounts of effort, financial resources, and I thought it was wonderful that Susan Grant mentioned how people thought that they were a bit stupid. That the people who created these things that history has now allowed us to categorically treat as important works of art or creations, at the time I'm sure lots of people said they were stupid as well. Now, I feel that we're very fortunate in our next speaker as a man that lots of people have spent a lot of time talking about, some positively, some not positively. But nobody could have done more in terms of building a garden than Sir Roy Strong, who has created his own paradise on earth, the biggest formal garden in Britain since 1945, who has been influenced by Italy for many years, and is actually a man who knew well Sir Harold Acton, the person whose bequest we're partially celebrating in this conference. We're going to be very honoured to hear about the creation of this garden, but the most important issue for me is to feel some of the passion, the craziness maybe, that it takes to build the sort of thing that we all love so much in the Tuscan landscape. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I feel as though I'm the sort of cabaret. However, there we are. Well, I think really visitors who come to La Pietra, as far as I know, do not come here to learn about the sustainability of landscape. They come here to see a garden, a remarkable garden, a very curious garden, because its history is yet to be written. Much of it will be locked up in the archive in the villa. Who was Arthur Acton? What did he read? What gardens did he visit? What plants did he like? Well, not very many, because it's mostly everything's evergreen or grass. He certainly didn't like flowers. Was Harold Acton interested? No, he most certainly wasn't. Harold wasn't interested in the garden one bit. I mean, my late wife and I came to lunch here on our honeymoon in the winter of 1971 to 72. That was the first time I came here. And then I came here 2 or 3 other times. And then occasionally one saw him in London because Princess Margaret would give a party at Kensington Palace. And we'd troll along and Harold would have to sing some Chinese songs for her. But that's about what it extended to. And I often find people who talk about gardens and write particularly garden historians have never actually made one. And that I find extremely kind of irritating. I don't know whether it's true in Italy, but it's certainly true in England that some of the most influential gardeners have not been people who have done a course in landscape design. They are amateurs. I mean, huge influence of Vita Sackville-West and Harold Nicholson It's a brilliant garden in one sense. I find them absolutely loathsome as people, but the garden's quite good. And Lawrence Johnston at Hidcote is absolutely brilliant. And then you think of the influence in the UK of Rosemary Vere's Barnsley, Penelope Hobhouse's, the various gardens she did and all her writings. Then going north, of course, you have Ian Hamilton Finlay and people like that. So it is people coming in, as it were, from the side who have a huge impact. Well, you're looking at a painting I commissioned in 1995 when the garden was about 15 years old. I'm just what I call it extends to 4 acres. And I think I'll begin by describing, as it were, the cast. Yes, well, on my right, you see my wife, Julia Trevelyan Oman, extremely distinguished designer descending from two great Victorian intellectual dynasties. 6 of her productions are still in the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden. She worked with Gielgud Olivier, Jonathan Miller, Alan Bennett, everyone. Designer of the Year Award from television, CBE, Royal Designer for Industry. Her production of Bohème, which is now 40 years old, is now being shown for the last time at the Royal Opera House. She was extremely distinguished in her own right. Her idea of a nightmare was to be called Lady Strong. On the left that's me, and who am I? Well, in brief, I'm a grammar school boy who ascended by scholarships, and I became director of the National Portrait Gallery when I was 31. It's a very young appointment, and I hope turned the place round, kicking off with what has become a landmark show, the first recognition in a national collection of photography, Cecil Beaton Retrospective, which set me off on my career. And then at 38, I became director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, and I won't go into all that. And I have a reputation as a scholar on the Elizabethan and Jacobean period, and I've written about gardens, I've written about practically everything, and done quite a lot of television. Anyway, that sort of briefly sketches that in. Well, here you see the land. There's the house. Well, I think we'll go on to what I call to reality. And that's an aerial view about 1980. We married in 1971, and we started to look for a house. And the house is in Herefordshire on the borders of Wales. And you may well ask, why buy a house which is 3.5 hours from London, if not 4? And why did we buy it there? The answer to it is poverty. Which is often the case with many people. It was the only way we could buy what we wanted as a house, what my wife would describe as a gentleman's house at that particular period. If you go, there's the house. There's the cedar of Lebanon, which was there till a fortnight ago when we had a horrendous gale, as you've had here, and it blew it down. It's one of our great and noblest tree. You are, as it were, 10 to 15, about sort of 15 years on from the start of the garden. Hereford lies north that way, Ross-on-Wye south. If you go this way, you go towards Wales. Well, I can't recommend Wales. It sends you the most horrendous weather that anyone can send you. 23 degrees of frost, howling gales, God knows what else. It all comes from Wales and the Black Mountains. You go this way, you go to Worcestershire, where you can see it's a very odd section of land. Here, there was what was, in fact, a field, and the field was let to the farmer. And when we bought the house, I was 38 then, when we eventually moved in, and I said to her, don't talk to me about that garden. Well, there wasn't a garden, and the field was let out. And then suddenly, I had a four-line conversion on gardening. My wife was a gardener. She was brought up by her mother to be a gardener. And then suddenly, the farmer said, I don't want that field anymore for my cattle, and we were faced with a large field. And that was when furor hortensis and garden madness set in and has obsessed me for 40 years. And you may well ask, because it links in with what you've been hearing earlier, why we wanted to go to the country. The 70s in England were a simply devastating period. Everybody was on strike. I had a house in Brighton. We sat in it The electricians were on strike, the traffic lights didn't work, there was no heating, you couldn't cook anything, the railways were on strike, so you couldn't get a train and go back to London, and the whole of the 70s was total disruption, roaring inflation up to 20%, and we thought we've got to get out. The urban environment was crumbling. I mean, by just before when Thatcher came in, the litter was 20 feet deep in the streets of London in some areas. And we just thought we've got to get out into the country where we can have our own wood and burn a fire, we can get on a bicycle, we can grow our own vegetables, and all of that sort of thing, and make some sort of sustainable, dare I use that ghastly word, existence in the country. So that gives you roughly a kind of background to why we were there. Well, I'll show you some before and afters, just to... Well, that's the house as we bought it. It's sort of 1835, nondescript, really like a kind of small Jane Austen rectory with 1920s bay windows, a little bit added here for a housekeeper in the 20s and 30s, but pretty bleak, pretty grim. And that's the same house today, which I think is quite pretty, gentrified with pilasters, and my coat of arms and my wife's above, and a knot garden in front of it, which in reverse, here is a Jacobean knot with a yew hedge, and then there is an Italianate Vicenza statue, which I got. I did quite a chunk of the Prince of Wales's garden at Highgrove, and I got him 4 statues from Italy and ordered a duplicate. So when they dumped 4 at Highgrove, they came onto the Laskett and plonked Flora in her glade, and very nice she looks too. So that's the before and after. This is the view from the upstairs window looking towards Wales. I need hardly add. So you can see just a rough turnaround for cars, a greenhouse, and I don't know what the builders are like here. By the time they produced a quote to restore it, it had blown down. Here's a clapped-out garage, and down here some sort of vegetable garden. And that is the same view now, leading up to the, what is, well now, well that's the kitchen garden still, but it's now to the colonnade court. But that's how we developed that area of the garden. And there is the field. That's precisely what we started with. We don't know anybody else who's done that sort of thing at all. And I think it's important at this point. Rosemary Very was a great friend. And I pass this on to you. I pass this on to any group I talk to about gardening. She gave me 3 criteria before you judge any garden, and they're very good ones. She said you must take into account the design ability and the plantsmanship and the makers. In the case of the Laskett, it's my wife, Julia Trevelyan-Oman, and myself. Secondly, the amount of money that people have at their disposal. Well, I suppose I was paid £9,000 a year to direct the V&A with 12 acres of building, 750 staff, 5 branch museums, and sat on 9 national quangos unpaid. So I suppose that's about $18,000 a year. So there was no money behind that garden. Theatre design was appallingly paid, and that accounts for why the garden was done in reverse. You could plant the hedges and things like that, but you couldn't do the hard landscaping. So there you see the 2 gardeners trundling their weary away, making what became the Serpentine. There is an electric junction box there. It has taken 40 years to get that moved. It was moved by the electricity authorities last winter. And that's the same area today, which is the orchard. And there you can see, looking over to the front of the house, the cedar of Lebanon, fruit trees, and all of that. So that's, there we go on again. Well, I'll pass on anybody who makes a garden. This is why I'd like to know about Arthur Acton. You're influenced by people. It just doesn't, I mean, people who've got huge checkbooks and just bring in the big designers, that's one thing. But when you start yourself, and that's Cecil Beaton with his garden, small piece. Cecil was the first person to actually take me around a garden at Reddish House, Broadchalk. I stayed with him many times. And he'd actually made his garden. And it crossed my mind because as a junior and then director of the Portrait Gallery, of course, I went to all the great houses to look at their portraits. But it never occurred to me about the gardens. I thought, oh, well, they must have been there forever. Of course, they weren't. And you suddenly realize for the first time the revelation of being told, you can make a garden. It's not the sort of garden I wanted, but it told you something. And then you began to look around and think, well, what sort of garden? What other influences are at work? So there's the inspiration of Cecil. That garden, it's King Henry's hunting lodge, which is near Odium. And that is the garden of the great interior decorator. Lots of people he trained worked in America. Keith Irving was one of them. And John Fowler had the most exquisite taste. Very little money indeed. But the hunting lodge is just a marvelous garden with this wonderful stilt hedge, and there's a vista out there, and there's a little rose garden, all sorts of things. And he was a huge inspiration. So there's an inspiration. Fowler was an inspiration. Another garden that was an inspiration was Lawrence Johnston's Hidcote. And that's a garden of rooms. You go through a succession of enclosures of different shapes, corridors, up and down, and one thing and the other. Hidcote, we were staying with a rather grand hostess who forced the National Trust to open Hidcote for us on a January day. I'm very grateful to her, because if a garden looks sensational in winter, it will look sensational any time. I mean, I used to have a line in lectures on gardens when I narrowed my eyes and said, remember, flowers in a garden are a sign of complete failure. And there's a great truth in that. The Hidcote is a monument to the orchestration of space. It taught me that you lead people up to see a view to the countryside, and may lead them down to a statue or a street. There are narrow passages, they widen out, there are ovals, there are squares, there are rectangles, and basically gardening. It taught me that you have to plant your structure. And really gardening is placing human beings in space and controlling the way they look and the direction they go and to what they're attracted to. So that was another lesson for me. Levens, which is the locus classicus, of course, for the kind of historic romantic garden in Westmoreland, with this amazing topiary. I was always drawn towards that. We now know that really most of this is overgrown from the 17th century, when they would have been tiny little things, but it's grown into this fantastically romantic and wonderful garden, which everybody reproduces this garden as an absolute touchstone. And do we remember when the 70s is a period of horrible unhappiness in England? Everybody's on strike, everything's dislocated, there's a terrible kind of almost class war breaking out. And somehow you look back to the security of the past. There's a huge backward movement. I mean, what is ironical about the 1970s is that Lutyens and Jekyll had a revival. And Lutyens and Jekyll must have been one of the most intensive forms of gardening ever invented. And so in a period when there were dire financial straits, when the International Monetary Fund came in and the museum was cut by 150 staff in 1 year. It was a bloodbath. Everything was in a terrible state. But we look back to a kind of golden age. I mean, this is the sort of book one looked at. Country Life, great magazine, founded in 1897, still going. But Charles Latham's absolutely marvelous, wonderful, great garden photographer. Pictures of the gardens from the 1890s on to up to 1914 were a huge inspiration. I used to go for walks in these pictures thinking, oh, isn't that wonderful? I plant my hedge and cut it like that. I'll just have to wait 10 or 15 years. And there is a garden. It was a sense of escape and marvel. The Villa Gambaria and Italian gardens, of course. What again I think even British people forget is that England, the country, was in essence cut off from the rise of the fascist dictatorships about 1935-37, really up until the middle of the 50s. England went into isolation. And after the war, you couldn't have any money to travel, so you couldn't afford to travel. I first went to Italy in 1955. Now, seminal for me was Georgina Masson's book, which we already had referred to, which was the first book on Italian gardens to appear after the war. Of course, it was an absolute revelation. And this garden still remains an inspiration, although whenever I go to it now, really it all needs ripping out and replanting. It's overgrown and really rather sad, but it's a great bit of garden design. So all the Italian gardens, the sense of perspective and layout and manipulation of space and clipping of evergreens were all those sort of things that inspired me. Later in my garden making came the influence of Derek Jarman, the filmmaker, his famous film on Caravaggio. And he made a garden at Dungeness, which was just literally a kind of sheet of nothing onto which he just laid found objects and a few plants, but it had a huge impact. And then the other person who certainly influenced me, and I remember doing an interview with him, was Ian Hamilton Finlay's Little Sparta up in the lowlands of Scotland, which was really the ferme ornée of the 18th century, the garden that put ideas back into the garden, whereas so much of the 20th century was about garden style, but the notion that a garden conveyed philosophical ideas had completely gone, which was of course common in the Renaissance 17th and the 18th century. And so the Laskett garden in areas has Latin inscriptions or snatches of English poetry and so on and so on. Well, now we turn to, with speed, as everything must be here. That was my first amateur sketch, I think in 1976. The house is there, the side of the house there, not the front. Front of the house is up there, and the tree is there. And there was turnaround for cars, and so this was my initial plan. We'll see it in a minute. This is where we started. We stood there and just looked at a field full of grass, not knowing what to do. And then my wife, who was always right, said, there must have been a lawn tennis court there. Always right. So we mowed it back, and in December 1974, I planted the yew hedge around what was the rose garden. And other things developed. Also, you can see I'm thinking in terms of axes. There was a vista down here. Then there were two great avenues. One called Elizabeth Tudor, as you'll see. And why it's called Elizabeth Tudor is that I wrote a little book on Elizabeth I. My wife designed it, after which I proposed to her. And then there was another great vista up. Always it was meant to have quite large things, which I couldn't afford, but there were all these two great axes and then kind of wandering walks in between. The garage remained, we had very little money, and a new kitchen garden was made there. And so you can see the essence of something emerging out of that. And then a large, very ugly hedge we put in there to screen out a cottage we didn't own then, but which we later bought along there. Well, let's move on and see well, that's the kind of garden as it is now. And you see the various sort of, the V&A temple, the stag, the yew garden, the triumphal arch, all sorts of things around it, lots of tombs for pussycats, and so on and so on. Well, I'm going to keep coming back to this. I wanted this made like a kind of 18th century map, like Stowe or something like that. And we're going to start here. I think it's very important because I wrote a lot of garden design books which were hugely successful, and what the publishers will never allow you to print are pictures of how you start. Oh, we've got to have inspirational pictures. Well, I'll show you the non-inspirational ones. So we're going to start looking down here across what became the garden for the Queen's Silver Jubilee and then the Rose Garden. So that's how you start. If you don't have much money, there is the Rose Garden starting. There am I standing wearing my 1960s flares out. There I have just dug those beds. And you can see it's pretty rough. And I couldn't afford an ornament, so there's a kind of rockery in the middle there. So that's how we started. And I planted, inspired by Sissinghurst, a white garden. Don't plant a white garden, they're really awful. I immediately, the next year, introduced shades of lavender and purple. That is an aerial view. These are the sort of pictures no one will publish. And you can see the hedges growing, the beds in the rose garden. We've got a forest of birch trees there, the orchard in there where my wife collected old Herefordshire apple trees from the Welsh Marches. And there again, going further over there, you can see evergreens going up, and then there's the dreaded Wales with its weather over there. There we are where we moved on to the 80s. So you can see this garden, the Jubilee Garden, has begun to mature. The Diarist in the middle came from Cecil Wheaton's garden at Reddish, so he is in the garden, which I'm pleased. And I planted iceberg roses, which he loved, and lavender, which he also loved. And you can see how the birch trees have thrived. And then there are here amelanchias. Unfortunately, the soil here goes within a foot to 2 feet to rock. So there's always great difficulties. So the three of the amelanchias had to be trimmed back to the one that didn't grow, and you'll see how that goes on. But yew grows really quite quickly, and you can see something beginning to emerge. So you've now got up into the 80s. And then this is the rose garden, I would have thought, about 1990. Here we are, we've still got the amelanchias here. By then I've got 4 statues of the seasons, 2 obelisks with gilded balls I put at the top, and an ornament has arrived, and that came from my wife's aunt, Carola Oman, the Lady in Anton, who really was a celebrated biographer. So you can see how things prosper. Then we now reach, I would have thought about 1995, something like that. And you can see the white rose here, a little white pet. Things move around a bit in the garden. Catmint here. And the amelanchias, in the end, I had to take out. And then I replaced them with beech, which in fact will prosper. It doesn't need a big root system. And they're being trimmed into standards. And I've not had any trouble since. And you can see standard roses in there. So we reached about 1995, that. And then the rose garden in 2003, we'd always wanted to. This is what I mean. I'd resigned the V&A when I was 52 in 1987 and stepped out for a lot of reasons. You can't go on directing those places forever. I had tenure to the age of 65. It wouldn't have done me or the place any good. And joining what I call the private sector produced an influx of money, and I could afford to pave this using Victorian industrial brick and sandstone. And you can see the vista back is forming and the clipped standards there. And then we move on again. And that's the rose garden, again in summer. And then in about 2005, my wife died in 2003. And that was a tremendous blow, obviously, because the garden was by then 30 years old. And then I turned my attention first to the house in order to go on living there. And secondly, I turned my attention to the garden. The garden after 30 years, particularly if you plant a lot of quick-growing things, you can see them all there. A lot of things were going to have to come out, and you'll see that in a minute. And you're looking down onto what was the Jubilee Garden, which I relaid out, moved these ornaments here, moved the obelisks in there out here. The gardeners often said to me, "Oh, Sir Roy, we won't cement down that ornament. We know you'll move it." Well, I think the same certainly applies. I would have thought Arthur Acton was moving those statues around like no tomorrow. But you can see there's the beginning of a formal parterre here, which I planted with hostas. They were not a success. And then I planted as a parterre. And then finally, that's as it is the other day. I have a Dutch friend who always sends me every year 600 tulips, and I always choose orange because a tribute to the Netherlands, to the House of Orange, and the garden actually looks really rather wonderful. So that's a story of one of the gardens. We're going back to this. This is the Great Avenue. And that's how it started. They used to say about that poor sundial, it ought to be on wheels because it went everywhere. There is the dreaded Welsh Mountains. There is this hedge where we're kind of cutting out that cottage down there. And here you can see, there, in fact, it was a line of New Zealand beach. You can see, remember the boys cutting that field? This is this winding flower beds along here. Well, it doesn't look, I mean, people we took round the garden, we could see what that garden would be, but they just thought we were completely and utterly mad. They couldn't see it at all. This is 1980, and you can see the beach is still there. There's that hedge shutting out the cottage. There are two yews, which I know I will toporize. There's the cedar in front of the house. And a big monument was arrival. In 1980, I was awarded something called the Shakespeare Prize, which for half a century was awarded by a German foundation to the one person in the arts in Britain they considered had made the greatest contribution. And it was an incredible honor. The list is something like Henry Moore, Harold Pinter, Margot Fontaine, Alan Bennett, and just the lot. So I'm the only museum person ever to have it. So I said, I'm going to commemorate it in the garden, and up this reproduction of an urn by William Kent went. By then, as you've seen, there's the addition in between of some Irish yew. It's planted with daffodils. Now we move on a bit, we get into the 90s, and we paved. By then, the next thing, 1981 winter, there was 24 degrees of frost, which wiped out most of the garden, including the New Zealand beech. And I planted a peach lime avenue. I have to admit, it's inspired by the dreaded Sissinghurst. It's twice the length of the one at Sissinghurst. There is the column, which is to the two Elizabeths, the first and second. There's an inner yew hedge I planted along here. There are the Irish yew. And then there's a swagged hedge underneath of beech. That's not more difficult to see, but you can see it, how things have developed. And then move on a bit. And that was it, I would say, 2 years ago. You can see how that hedge has prospered. There, again, using colour wash was an innovation on the monuments. And then into the yew hedge, I planted standard hollies all the way along. And you have to be brave in gardening, because I'd waited 20 years for those standard hollies. And I went out in the spring of this year, and I said, chop them down. And I don't think this is a particularly good image, but that, in fact, clarifies that enormous avenue, 65 yards long. And it really looks better. It's this whole business of taking things out, which I think is so enormously important. And that's what I'll talk about next. Here we go back to this kind of area, where it applies to the whole of the garden. After 30 years, I find people over 60 completely seized up. They can't seem to do anything. I go to friends' gardens and I say, well, why don't you chop that down? Oh, I can't do that. And I say, why not? Well, I planted it. And I say, what the hell's that got to do with it? You don't need it. Chop it down, take it out. So we're going to look at this area here. And certainly about 8 years ago, I started on a massive rethink of the entire garden. And this is what you look down to, out of the orchard, to a statue of Britannia. And then these conifers, one of put in 3-4 feet high, look, monsters, absolute monsters. And I started the great cull. And gardening is about being brave. A garden one of the problems about La Pietra, it's got to be mummified. What's wrong with National Trust gardens? They're mummified. They're attempting to mummify. You can't mummify a garden. It has to continue to move on. And here they are. They're chopping away like blazes. And all this will come down. The whole of it will be chopped down and got rid of. And then you can see this lovely Acer agriceum, poor thing, beginning to struggle to emerge. And then this is what it revealed, that so much of the topiary, box, beech, yew, stood revealed, and the whole of this area was turned into a winding walk with a prairie planting of grasses and perennials the whole way. The whole of this was opened up so you could see the other side of the pleached avenue. And it makes such a contrast. You have this enormously formal, grand avenue on a huge scale, and then you come across this area which is nothing but flowers and meandering and something entirely different. And things grow quickly. This is what I think the other thing people who make gardens forget. You can see there's the hedge around the orchard. I remember planting that in 1978. It was never fed, it was never watered. We didn't have any labor or anything at all. And it just grew, and I clipped it into that. And then you can see all the conifers have been ripped out of here, and this is planted. And then you can see how quickly, within 2 years, it had grown to that. I should add, in terms of labor, we started with 2 men once a fortnight. If I fell on my knees, one may come in between. Then, in the 80s, I was suddenly asked to write books on garden design, and my first book, much to my surprise, sold 200,000 copies in 6 languages. And Rosemary Very said, you do realize you can now claim the garden on tax. So everything changed. So we had somebody who passed as a gardener 5 days a week. And then he lasted till the early 90s. And then the present head gardener came. And then after my wife died, the under gardener came. So the entire of this very elaborate garden over 4 acres is kept going by 2 men on 4 days a week. And I think it is important to bear all those things in mind, because I've seen people go to gardens and say, oh, there's a weed there. Well, you have to ask, does that person have any help? What sort of resources do they have? Before, I think that Rosemary Vere's advice on passing judgment on a garden is incredibly important. It's very easy to cock a snook, but if you take those different things into consideration, it really makes you seriously think about the nature of making a garden. Now we're going to move on, because I can't do the whole of the garden, but I always wanted to do a great avenue up here. And then in 2007, I thought I'll go for it, because you've got the huge avenue of the parterre here going up and a cross-axis going across there. We can't do all that. A temple to the Victoria and Albert Museum there, and so on and so on. But this always needed, I always wanted to do this. So you'll see. Well, that's as it was, let's say, 10 years ago, near the house, looking out from the breakfast room, the fountain, a beech hedge, and then you can glimpse topiary beyond it, and then more conifers, and then another hedge, and there's that dreaded garage, and then there's the kitchen garden beyond that. And I always longed to get a wonderful path going up. And here we are beginning to do it. We're beginning to chop the whole. You can just see the house through there and the fountain. All of this is going to be ripped out. All of this is going to be demolished. You can see. And again, I think these are the pictures that you never see in garden making. And there, the garage has just been completely demolished. There's the field hedge, and then beyond it, you can glimpse the old kitchen garden. So it was a massive, massive operation, but hugely, hugely exciting. And that is it when it was finished. I don't know what happens here, but certainly in England, you have to bag statuary in the winter, or else it will be frost damage. And certainly you do, don't you, in Russia and Eastern Europe and in the north. So you can see I've taken the beech hedge out from behind. They're revealing the whole of this topiary garden. So you go up and then you turn left and have that vista down to the parterre and the rose garden, which is a lovely surprise. And then you go up here and ascend through about 3 quite small different gardens. And then you end up, I redid the kitchen garden, but not for that long. So you come up, you're still going up this, there's a young yew hedge there, 4 statues of the arts. I put these curtain walls each side with knobs on the top, a kind of entrance. And then, there's that dreadful electric junction box. With a bit of luck, that'll disappear in the next 2 or 3 years. And then there is something I put up 18 months ago. And that's it. It's called the colonnade, because I now open the garden to the public, and one is made well aware opening any garden makes certain demands. Like when it rains, where do they shelter? Well, this is was there since spring 2014. And it's what I thought, well, I'd put up a lovely orangery there, but I couldn't afford that. But it's amazing what you can do with 4 phony ionic pillars and an entablature. No, the whole of the garden is one great, marvellous fudge up. Well, Beaton's was like that. It was all fudged up. Most 18th century gardens were full of tents and things made of papier-mâché or trompe-l'oeil cutouts placed at the end. I mean, the idea everybody was building in stone and the rest of it is a complete fantasy. But it does give a lovely concourse area, and as we do a number of charity events, it's wonderful. It's got very good acoustics here. An American gave me that reproduction of the famous luncheon bench, and I put an inscription in memory of my wife, RS and JTO. I put that everywhere, and the laurels will go up here and will conceal that. And then we look the other way, and There are 4 parterre beds. At the moment, they've got a marvellous display of tulips, clipped bay pyramids, arches each side. This side you look out onto the countryside, which is absolutely marvellous, and that way you look onto other aspects of the garden. But and what is terribly important, you must continue to change and alter a garden as long as you live. And most people don't have the courage to do that. They just simply can't dig up what they planted. I mean, a garden is the story of perpetual reinvention and renewal. I always think of those accounts of people in the picturesque period, late 18th century, beginning of the late 18th, beginning of the 19th, when they would go in their carriages around the grounds, and the squire would say, take that branch off the tree, because then we'll be able to see the manor house in the distance. All that kind of composing of pictures I find absolutely fascinating. Well, this is composing, as you can see a picture down to the fountain splashing away in the distance. All that I find incredibly exciting and interesting. And then I've sort of saved my little bit of Italy. Of course, up until the last, well, obviously this is incredibly Italianate for England, all this. Now we go on, and we're going to look at what in fact was the first garden I planted, because we bought the house, and after we bought the house, I became fascinated by gardening, and then realized we bought the wrong house. Because you read any garden book, things like Jekyll and Lawrence Weaver, a small country house garden, the house should be there, formal around, and then dissolving into a kind of wilderness. Well, the house was here, and the only garden room I could plant in alignment with the house was there. There was, flora in her glade, there was the parterre. And in fact, it was a salvation, because a lot of this garden is really too grand for what is really not a very grand house. So I've saved this up to the end because it's something I've just done, and one's passion is always. But this again is another photograph they'll never publish, and that is how we started. All this has changed. There's a conservatory there, and the windows have been Gothicized, and this, that, and the other. But this is, I would have thought, the winter of 75 to 76, but implanted in 74. Sprigs of yew. I dug those beds with my own hands, and we put those in. A couple of phony ornaments, something there that's going to be clipped into something, God knows what, and a couple of Irish yew here. Well, they've grown so enormous, in the end I took them out. Now that's looking down on the same garden a little further on, and you can see things have prospered. The hedge is beginning to go up, and there is a degree of movement here, not much, but then the grass is still there. Well, that goes on and on through the late 70s, through the 80s, until by the beginning of the 90s, all the grass was taken up, and there was one really wonderful box parterre, very pretty with standard roses and planting and the rest of it. And then in 99 came something which is beginning to invade or really obtrude in Italy, and that is box blight. And that the whole of this had to be dug up and burnt. The whole of the box in the rose garden, the litany of things that had to be destroyed as by the introduction of cylindrocladium boxicola. It was absolutely devastating. The whole of this was wiped out, and the whole of a lot of the other gardens were wiped out, back to square one. It was incredibly disheartening. But that box blight is throughout the gardens in the UK, and anybody, you either nurture your own cuttings, or if you buy boxed in, you put it in quarantine. Now we move on, and that's what we replaced it with. My wife designed a garden which was clipped yew with golden standards. And here you can see, and the amelanchias around the edge, well, they were taken out. And then you can see this lion, which comes from the Houses of Parliament, which belonged to my wife's grandfather, Sir Charles Oman, MP for the University of Oxford and Chitchliffe Professor of History at Oxford. And I waited 40 years for this to be trained like that. And then I stood there in the autumn of last year and I said, chop it down. And that's what I built. That's my little, I suppose, nymphaeum. There's a statue of Apollo with a kind of grotto, rough behind and trickling water 2 more classical statues. And I think it looks absolutely marvelous, and it will have inscriptions commemorating my 80th birthday in August. So it might be my last gesture. We haven't done the planting behind yet of flowering trees, which I think will look very pretty. But what I'm really saying is, I mean, Italy echoes through this garden, but in a way it's bits and pieces, and I think that it's like Japanese gardens. They don't really translate, and although Italy has been an enormous influence on English gardens, they're always kind of naturalized, or they're never the same. And therefore, I think with La Pietra, it isn't really an Italian garden when you look at it. It's not really the essence of the Renaissance or Baroque Italian garden. It's trying to be, but it's like a kind of stage set. And to some extent, that's true here. It is like a stage set, but it gives me enormous pleasure to go and see that. So that is really it. It's the story of one man making a garden on very modest means. And I'm proud to say, now we've opened it, people absolutely love it. And it gives enormous pleasure to open a garden to the public, absolutely huge. And we're always booked up for the entire season. We open 2 days a week to groups. And I do commend to you the excitement of making a garden. Because in England we have terrible television programs where people go away for the weekend and there's no garden on Friday, and they come back and there's a complete garden there in full flower. I mean, one of the joys of gardening is the making of it. And I'm very glad in England there is still space for people who aren't professional designers, who want to make their own gardens. And some of the loveliest gardens I've seen are people who I mean, this is not cheap, this garden, but many other people have done gardens that I know where, you know, the ornaments are improvised from stuff they rescued from rubbish heaps. The plants are cuttings from friends. And they're beautiful, and they bring tears to my eyes. And I've seen gardens where £500,000 has been chucked, and they're just awful. And it's absolutely true. I mean, a garden, although I wrote a lot of garden design books, and it's a design solution. The one thing I look for in any garden, and I'm not sure it's actually here, I look for the spirit of the maker. And one of the things that touches me most, people come and visit. My wife has been dead for 12 years, and people come up to me and say, "Your wife is everywhere in this garden. She's still here." And I don't ask them. I find that extraordinary. And they said the garden has such a potent atmosphere. And gardens do have potent atmosphere. They're like houses. When you house hunt, often you get out of the car and then get straight back into it, or you go through the front door and you're repelled. Gardens also have that quality. They either entice into a kind of magic world which enchants and lifts the spirit and the soul to contemplate things, or else they can go the other way. So this is my small amateur contribution to a day dedicated to what is a great villa garden and a sustainable landscape, and what is something on a gargantuan scale, which I hope will continue to be cherished. And I long for the archive to be open and for a book to be really written about Arthur Acton and about her too, and what was it all about? What were they doing? Where did he go? What did he see? What books did he have? And for God's sake, I'm so pleased you got everything, because the first thing that National Trust did when they got Hidcote was sell the library. We don't know what he looked at. Remember that, the importance of archives. Anyway, there we are. That's it. A change, I think, is the essence of the garden. At the moment, I'm in negotiations to pass the garden to a benevolent society and I mean, with it goes a mandate. I mean, obviously with it goes a substantial endowment, but the mandate is that it should be changed. That if that garden gets old and boring, dig it up, throw it away and put something new there. Don't get it stuck. I mean, there are certain fixed points. I mean, the problem with this place is that it's stuck. It's stuck. I mean, what can it mean to younger people? I mean, it's stuck. I mean, I should probably be up there with Julia looking down and thinking, oh, God, look what they've done. But a bit of me would say, good luck to them. Moving on. Everything in the garden is about tomorrow. It's not about today, it's tomorrow. And I think I would find that very exciting. So there we are, yes, I am all for change. I'm all for change. As long as it gives delight and pleasure and information, it's not... And in a way, the garden is... I suppose it is actually an expression of a marriage. That is absolutely true. But I don't think that will ever particularly be lost. But I do advocate change, and I do advocate to you to try and make a garden, even if it's only a few pots on a balcony. Because I've had a lot to do with garden historians, and they're kind of walking plant death, most of them. I just think, get your hands in the soil, get to grips with actually making and doing something. And most of them don't. They all talk about theory, and they've never done anything. So, again, as I say, change, because it gives it energy. You need energy. Anybody else?